The ridicule didn't begin with a whisper. It began with a loud, callous guffaw from the seat of a buckboard wagon. It was September 1891, and the golden hues of early autumn were settling over the rugged expanse of the Yellowstone River Valley in Montana Territory. To the hardscrabble homesteaders who had been fighting this unforgiving land for a decade, battling drought, locusts, and blizzards, seeing Sarah Miller mix mortar and lay red clay bricks on the roof of a rough-cut woodshed wasn't just strange. It was a flagrant display of incompetence. Frank Carter pulled on his reins, bringing his team of heavy drafts to a halt on the dirt road. Frank was a burly, opinionated man, a German immigrant who had proved up his claim years ago and considered himself the unassailable authority on proper farming methods in the county. He watched Sarah, a stoic woman of 47, methodically trowel mortar onto a brick with the precision of a master mason. "Sarah, have you finally let the prairie wind blow your sense away?" Frank shouted, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "Everyone knows a woodshed is meant to be kept cold and dry. You put a chimney in there, you mean heat. Heat brings moisture, and moisture rots wood faster than rot-gut whiskey. That's just simple sense." Sarah didn't pause. She didn't even tilt the brim of her bonnet to acknowledge him. Her hands, weather-beaten and calloused from 6 years of managing 80 acres alone, continued their rhythmic work. She had been a widow since her husband, Jack, died when a plow blade shattered and took his life, leaving her with a mortgage and a stark choice: give up and move to the city to scrub laundry, or stay and fight. She chose to stay. "You're going to ruin your whole winter supply trying to warm it like a pet cat." Frank laughed, looking around as if performing for an audience, though only the endless grass witnessed his mockery. That woman's finally lost her mind. But Sarah wasn't building a chimney for comfort. She was executing a plan. She remained impassive, her face a mask of steely determination. She had learned long ago that arguing with men like Frank, men entrenched in tradition and blinded by their own ego, was pointless. They didn't listen to explanations from a woman. They only listened to success or failure. Inside the shed, the air was thick with the scent of drying oak and the faint metallic tang of a heating stove. To the neighbors, this structure was a monument to madness. But to Sarah Miller, it was a sanctuary of meticulous engineering. Sarah wasn't operating on intuition. She was operating on data. Her secret weapon wasn't magic, but a tattered agricultural bulletin from the University of Minnesota Extension Service that she had requested by mail months ago. The pamphlet, titled "Efficient Wood Combustion for Farm Heating," was written by a forestry professor who treated firewood not as a chore, but as a fuel source governed by the laws of physics. The bulletin laid out a sobering scientific reality. Green wood, freshly cut from living trees, held nearly 60% moisture by weight. Burning it was a fool's errand. The fire wasted precious energy boiling off that water before it could generate any real heat, creating steam instead of warmth and coating the chimney in dangerous flammable creosote. The professor's research was definitive. To burn efficiently, wood needed a moisture content between 15% and 20%. Achieving that naturally took 2 years of air drying, time Sarah didn't have. So she improvised. She turned her shed into a makeshift kiln. In the center of the room sat a small, cast-iron potbelly stove, fed sparingly with last year's seasoned wood. It wasn't roaring, it was humming. Sarah checked the thermometer she had mounted on the wall. The mercury hovered at exactly 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the sweet spot. If it got too cool, the drying would stall. Too hot, and she risked warping the timber or sparking a blaze. She had cut vents near the floor to draw in fresh, cool air, which warmed as it rose past the stove, absorbing the moisture seeping from the stacked logs before escaping through the vents in the roof. It was a perfect, invisible convection engine. While the town slept, Sarah was in her shed 3 times a day, adjusting the damper, feeding the fire, and weighing sample logs on her kitchen scale to track their water loss. She was disciplined, vigilant, and utterly alone in her understanding. Meanwhile, a mile down the road, Frank Carter was feeling complacent. He had cut 20 cords of wood in late August. A bit late, but he was a strong man, and he trusted the old ways. He had stacked his wood outside under a canvas tarp, just as his father had taught him back in the old country. Frank sat on his porch smoking his pipe, looking at his massive, imposing woodpile with a sense of arrogant satisfaction. He didn't need thermometers or university pamphlets. He had tradition. He imagined Sarah over in her hot shed, wasting fuel to warm up firewood, and chuckled to himself. "Let her play her games," Frank muttered to his wife, Martha. "When the first nor'easter hits, we'll see who stays warm and who freezes." He had no idea that the traditional wood sitting in his yard was effectively a pile of wet sponges waiting to betray him. The trap was set, not by Sarah, but by nature itself. And winter was coming to spring it. The reckoning didn't arrive with a shout, but with a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. In mid-November, the temperature plummeted from a tolerable 40 degrees to single digits in a matter of hours. It was the kind of treacherous, bone-chilling cold that signaled the true arrival of a Montana winter, freezing the Cheyenne River solid within 3 days. This was the moment the unforgiving laws of nature took over, stripping away opinions and leaving only facts. Inside the Carter homestead, the atmosphere was chaotic and smoky. Frank Carter, usually so sure-footed and confident, found himself fighting a losing battle against his own stove. When he shoved his traditionally seasoned logs into the firebox, they didn't catch with a hearty roar. They hissed and sputtered like live things fighting the flames. The wood, still heavy with trapped summer moisture, refused to burn cleanly. Instead of heat, the logs released clouds of thick, acrid smoke that billowed back into the room whenever the wind shifted, filling the house with a stinging haze. His wife, Martha, watched with mounting anxiety as a thick, tar-like crust of creosote began to choke their chimney, a terrifying fire hazard that threatened to burn the house down from the inside out. But the cold was the real enemy. Despite feeding the stove constantly, the house remained drafty and uncomfortable. The wet wood simply couldn't generate enough BTUs to fight the sub-zero temperatures outside. Frank did the math, and the numbers were terrifying. He was burning through 3/4 of a cord per week, far rapidly than the half cord he had budgeted. At this unsustainable rate, his family would be out of fuel by January, with 2 brutal months of winter left to face. A mile away, the scene at Sarah Miller's farmhouse was startlingly different. Sarah brought in armloads of wood from her heated shed, oak and ash that felt lightweight and sounded hollow when knocked together. She had tested them. They held a perfect 18% moisture content. When she placed them in her stove, the reaction was immediate. The wood caught fire instantly, burning with steady, intense flames that radiated a deep, penetrating warmth. There was no hissing, no sputtering, no stinging smoke. Outside, the difference was visible to anyone looking at the skyline. While Frank's chimney belched heavy, gray clouds that smelled of unburnt fuel, Sarah's chimney released a thin, almost transparent wisp of vapor. It was the signature of immaculate combustion. Sarah sat in her rocking chair, the room toasty and clear, knitting by the light of a lamp. She was using a third less wood than her neighbors, yet her home was a sanctuary. Her surplus wasn't just a number. It was security, insurance against the disaster that was slowly creeping toward the Carter doorstep. The mockery had stopped. The cold had silenced the laughter, and in its place, a quiet, desperate respect was beginning to take root in the valley. Frank stood by his window, shivering despite his heavy wool coat, watching that clear, taunting wisp of smoke rising from Sarah's house. The science he had laughed at was now the only thing keeping her warm, while his tradition was leaving him out in the cold. By early December, the silence between the 2 homesteads became heavier than the snowdrifts piling up against the fence lines. But inside the Carter house, the fear was becoming palpable. Frank Carter's pride was a formidable thing, built like a stone wall over decades of being the local authority. But the freezing temperatures were chipping away at it, brick by brick. It was Martha who finally swung the sledgehammer. She had watched the soot blacken her walls and heard the wind whistle through the drafty corners long enough. She made it crystal clear. She didn't care about his dignity. She cared about their children freezing. So, on a gray Sunday afternoon, Frank put on his coat, pulled his hat low, and began the longest walk of his life. He trudged up Sarah's driveway, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. When he knocked, the sound was tentative, lacking his usual bluster. Sarah opened the door. She didn't look surprised, nor did she look triumphant. A wave of warm, clean air rushed out from her hallway. A stark, invisible slap in the face compared to the smoky chill of his own home. She simply stepped aside and invited him in for coffee. There was no gloating. Sarah didn't make him grovel in the entryway. Instead, after he mumbled through a halting, painful admission that his wood wasn't burning right, she did something magnanimous. She stood up, grabbed her shawl, and said, "Come with me, Frank." She led him out to the woodshed. Stepping inside was like stepping into a different climate zone. It was balmy, smelling of dry timber and earth. Frank stood there, stunned by the consistent, gentle heat radiating from the stove in the center. "Here," Sarah said, handing him a split log of ash from her stack. "Take it." Frank took the wood. It was shocking, feather-light and bone-dry. It felt like seasoned furniture lumber, not firewood. Sarah then reached into Frank's pocket, pulled out the damp, heavy glove he had been wearing to handle his own wood, and placed it next to the log. The contrast was undeniable. "It's not magic, Frank," Sarah explained, her voice level and pragmatic. She walked him through the ventilation vents, pointing out the convection currents, explaining the chemistry of moisture content in plain farmer's terms. She showed him the thermometer sitting steadily at 95 degrees. Frank listened. For the first time in years, he truly listened. He realized that while he had been relying on the way it's always been done, Sarah had been relying on physics. The shame was searing. "I was wrong," Frank said, his voice rough. The words cost him something substantial. "I called you foolish. I laughed at your chimney, but I was the fool." He looked at her, expecting a lecture. "Will you help me? I'll pay you." Sarah considered him. She could have refused. She could have let him freeze as payment for his mockery. But that wasn't her nature. "No charge for the knowledge," she said firmly. "But you build your own shed. You provide the labor. And Frank?" She caught his eye, her gaze unwavering. "You tell the truth about where you learned it. I won't have you claiming this as your own idea." "Agreed," Frank nodded, offering a hand that was no longer condescending but humbled. "You have my word." By the summer of 1892, the landscape of the Yellowstone River Valley had begun to change in a visible, transformative way. It started with Frank Carter. True to his word, he built his own heated woodshed, but he didn't stop there. He became an evangelist for the method he had once mocked. Whenever a neighbor complained about wet wood or chimney fires, Frank would point them down the road to the widow's farm. "Go ask Sarah," he'd say, his voice respectful and firm. "She's the one who figured it out. It's a miller shed." The name stuck. It spread from farm to farm, carried by letters to relatives in the Dakotas and conversations at the general store. What was once ridiculed as the widow's folly was now known across the territory as the miller shed, shorthand for any structure that used controlled, scientific heat to season lumber. Sarah didn't change who she was. She remained humble and industrious, never seeking the spotlight. But the spotlight found her anyway. That summer, Professor William Henderson, the very man who wrote the bulletin Sarah had studied, traveled by train and wagon all the way from Minnesota. He had heard rumors of a woman in Montana who had perfectly adapted his laboratory theories into a practical, life-saving reality. He spent 2 days with Sarah, sketching her ventilation system and taking notes on her temperature logs. When his next article was published, it didn't just talk about theory. It featured detailed drawings of Sarah's design, praising it as a triumph of ingenuity over blind habit. Sarah lived for another 23 years, long enough to see her foolish idea become standard practice across the northern plains. Commercial lumber mills began adopting similar kiln drying methods, scaling up the very process she had pioneered in her backyard. But the true legacy wasn't just the dry wood or the warm houses. It was the brick chimney itself. Long after Sarah passed away, that chimney remained standing. A solitary, enduring monument against the prairie sky. Travelers used it as a landmark, pointing it out as they passed. That's the Miller place. That's where the change started. The story of Sarah Miller teaches us a profound lesson about the difference between wisdom and tradition. Her neighbors froze because they confused familiar with correct. They assumed that because something had always been done a certain way, it must be the best way. Sarah proved that sometimes the person the crowd calls crazy is simply the only one who can see the future. What do you think? Have you ever had an idea that everyone else laughed at, only to be proven right in the end? Or have you ever been in Frank's shoes, holding onto a tradition that was actually holding you back? Let us know your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and American ingenuity, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We bring you powerful stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every single week. Don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.